Hello, my name is Rob Lee. I'd like to welcome you all to the SANS Lightning Summit on SolarWinds. For those of you who have not experienced a lightning talk ever, I'm just going to do a quick background on what our intent here is and why we targeted the SolarWinds topic for one of these first ones that we're trying to accomplish, and then go through the overall way the format's going to work, and then focus on how you can participate. A SANS Lightning Summit is kind of similar to a regular summit, which we have requested a series of speakers, in this case, SANS faculty, that have been working, in this case, the front lines of SolarWinds incident since December, and bringing in a variety of aspects of incident response techniques, cyber threat intelligence, threat hunting, blue team operations, and overall what the future means for cybersecurity as a result of the overall SolarWinds incident. Now that it's been 6 weeks, since the majority of us have been dealing with the overall impact of SolarWinds, what are some of the key takeaways that a lot of the individuals out there in the field are finding when they're thinking back and seeing how organizations have responded and dealt with the implications of SolarWinds over the past couple of months. The Lightning Summit format is intended to go through a series of speakers, each one 10 minutes in length, focusing on each of the topics that I outlined. The hope here is through this rapid series of talks that we're going to be able to highlight some of the key takeaways that individuals have experienced as a result and thought about as a result of the SolarWinds incident. My role at SANS is I'm the curriculum director. I lead most of the classes at SANS and all of the faculty. I used to work in the digital forensics incident response and leading that curriculum. So I have a huge background in incident response and threat hunting techniques as a whole. And I'm one of the co-authors of both Windows Forensics and incident response courses at SANS, Security 500 and 508 respectively. To kick things off, we're going to be asking our first speakers to begin presenting, and then I'll jump in, transitioning from speaker to speaker as we're going forward. Now, how can you participate? At the end of the 60 minutes worth of talks, we have 6 speakers, each 10 minutes each. We're going to host a panel for questions fronted by you, the audience, and attendees that we would potentially engage the speakers that are going to be working through the presentation. So if you have a specific speaker you would like to ask a question to, or if you want to ask for everyone, please just note that in your question. If it's something you'd like to hear different perspectives on, or if you want it specifically for John Hubbard or Katie Nichols, you might say this one is specifically for Katie about something that she said, and we'll try to redirect that to her through the limited time that we have the Q&A at the end. All right, without further ado, we're going to kick things off. Just remember that each one of these is aimed to be about 10 minutes each, and we're going to be cycling through all the speakers one at a time as we're moving forward. All right, I'll be back right at the end of Katie's talk.
All right, I am up first. I only got 10 minutes, so let's dive right into it. I am Katie Nichols. I'm going to be talking to you about some key cyber threat intelligence takeaways from SolarWinds, and I'll talk about why I have that in quotation marks in just a moment. So a little bit about me. I'm an instructor for SANS Forensics 578, Cyber Threat Intelligence. That is what I love to do. My passion, I'm also Director of Intelligence at Red Canary. And in my free time, I like to exercise and organize things. That's my breakfast shelf for any other home organizers, home edit fans. But what is cyber threat intelligence? Kind of helps you frame what I'm going to talk about today. I think about it as informing decisions, bringing context about threats to help inform decisions. So that's what I hope to kick off our Lightning Summit with today. I'm going to give you 3 key takeaways. First takeaway is going to be, well, we need to remember this isn't one single compromise. It's a series of different compromises. And Rob, I think we got some slide lag. There we go. The joys of virtual presenting. Not a single compromise, which I realize this is a little counterintuitive because we called this the SolarWinds Lightning Summit. But if you think about all the different organizations affected, Remember back, what was it, 6 weeks ago, Rob said, seems like a year ago, this all started when FireEye revealed they had been compromised. I know. And then we learned about SolarWinds. Then we learned about all these other organizations that had been affected in different ways. Not everyone was compromised the same level as SolarWinds. Microsoft had some source code viewed. Palo Alto was affected. Multiple government agencies in the US had been affected. Cisco and Mimecast was one a week or two ago that revealed they were affected as well. I don't think we're going to stop getting these revelations either. I think we're just going to keep learning about new organizations affected. And so the important point here is that we can't just lump this into a single SolarWinds compromise, because by doing that, we're really mischaracterizing the threat. Every time a different organization is compromised, our threat changes a little bit. So that's our first key takeaway from the threat perspective. Not just a single compromise, lots of different organizations were affected. And I hate to say it, but there are probably going to be more to come. Second key takeaway, the names around this thing. I hear so often from analysts in this community, why can't we all agree on a single name? And maybe no end to this frustration for this SolarWinds series of compromises. But I'm here to tell you and explain that there are good reasons why there are multiple names for these series of compromises and threats and why that matters. So let's dive into some of these names that were used. First off, we have what I call maybe incident or campaign names. One that everyone's probably heard is SolarWinds with an O to be a little confusing, Microsoft. That's Microsoft's name for kind of these SolarWinds series of incidents. Palo Alto uses a different name, SolarStorm. And so often people are like, well, why don't they just use the same name? Here's the challenge with names. Microsoft, who has a certain set of visibility and analytical methodology, they decided how they define SolarWinds. Palo Alto came in and they said, hey, we're putting in another web shell called Supernova. We're going to consider that part of our series of incidents and campaigns, and we're going to call that SolarStorm. So you might be frustrated because we have a lot of names to keep track of, but really important to remember, as much as you can, look to the source. What are they naming this? How do they define it? That'll let you more accurately communicate about what exact threat you mean and you're trying to protect against. So we got those incident names. Sort of think of those as overall incident or campaign references. Then we have another set of names for clusters or groups. First one from FireEye, UNC2452. And this is really significant because FireEye uses this term UNC to refer to uncategorized groups. What this means is that FireEye does not have the confidence to say with high confidence that UNC2452 is an APT like Russia. There has been reporting that the SolarWinds compromise is likely tied to Russia, but FireEye themselves, for the UNC group they named, have not made that association, which is significant because it means that they don't have the confidence to attribute it to a country. Velexity used a different name. And again, you might be saying, just use the same name, Velexity. Well, Velexity wrote a blog post pretty early on in this series of incidents on a group they called Dark Halo. And again, they had slightly different visibility from FireEye and Microsoft. They had visibility into some think tanks that were compromised. And so they said the group behind that series of compromises is called Dark Halo. Next one, CrowdStrike created an activity cluster. A little different than a group because often a threat group implies some kind of person behind the keyboard. No, CrowdStrike, when they came out with malware analysis relating to a Sunspot, I believe, they said that's related to an activity cluster, just a series of incidents, series of things that they pulled together called Stellar Particle. Again, you might be saying, just use one name, but really important to remember they're different names for different reasons based on different visibility and TTPs, which I want you to keep in mind throughout the rest of this summit. When someone's talking about certain TTPs, maybe it fits into UNC2452 or Dark Halo. And if you know, for example, you're a think tank, maybe you want to focus more on Dark Halo TTPs. Last bullet point there, I mentioning the uncategorized group. None of these teams have attributed any of these clusters or groups to Russia or China or Iran. There has been a DHS report saying it's likely associated with Russia, but again, we're talking about a few different compromises, different TTPs. So just keep an eye towards that no private company has come out and related any of these groups to Russia. We got more names. I know we got Sunspot, Sunburst. My teammate said we should call it Sunburn. We got Teardrop, we got Raindrop. Those four on the left, very much associated with that SolarWinds compromise. But man, this stuff is confusing. You might remember early on, there were these other two malware families mentioned in the FireEye series of countermeasures, Supernova and Cosmic Gale, which later Microsoft and FireEye kind of clarified those two on the right are believed to be a different group than the ones on the left. Reuters came out earlier this week with some reporting suggesting maybe Supernova is tied to China. We don't have clear evidence other than that reporting, so we'll keep an eye on that. But again, the point here is there are a lot of different names meaning different things. And when you're talking about the malware, even remember that there's general agreement across different teams that there are two different groups behind these clusters of malware. A lot of names, so takeaway here, use the name of the source you're talking about. It helps you get more clarity on what is exactly the threat you're trying to deal with. Last key takeaway, threat modeling. I love this term. Threat modeling, I think, is all about aligning your organization with the threats that matter to you. One of the things that I think is so tough about this series of compromises is that your threat model differs depending on the kind of organization you are. So a couple questions that I think you should think about as you're trying to figure out of all of these names and threats, which one should my organization focus on? Think about your environment, right? Do you use any products or services from any of the known compromised third parties? If so, you probably need to look very carefully at what connections you're making to your network. Do you provide third-party services to other people, to customers? Because then you better make sure nothing in your environment is owned that's being spread to them. Do you use cloud providers? If anyone uses Office 365 or ADFS, you're going to have very different threats to think about than someone who doesn't. The last one, building software. Some people have said, oh, do we have to worry about supply chain builds? Well, depends if your organization builds software or not. So the key here is, as you're trying to figure out which of these multitude of threats to figure out what you need to focus on, think about your own environment, what you have that adversaries could care about. And I like to use this kind of overlapping Venn diagram when I think about threat modeling. So on the left in the gray is sort of a fictional software development company, right? Totally fictional. And they have a bunch of stuff internally. They make software, they use ADFS. In the red, think about all of the billion tweets and blog posts and news stories you're getting every single day, all of the SolarWindsy things. And you have to try to figure out what matches up with my fictional organization. So for example, hey, we make software. So maybe we should look at that Sunspot malware that injected into the build process. We have ADFS. Maybe we need to focus on Golden SAML, which some of our other presenters are going to be talking about. So whole idea behind threat modeling, take what your organization has, take all of the many multitude of threats and start to match those things up. I have a link and these slides will be shared. If you want more on threat modeling, feel free to check that out. In summary, a lot of names, a lot of threats here. Be specific about what you're talking about, and then think about what aspects of these multitude of threats really matter to your organization. And so as the other speakers are going to share different TTPs and priorities, think about which ones really matter for your organization based on your own threat model. A whole bunch of links there in that reference from MITRE. They've done a great job pulling a lot of these links together. And I have links in the slides as well, which will be shared later. With that, I am off. So if you have questions, feel free to reach out in Q&A or on Twitter, and I will pass it back to you, Rob. I think I was just over 10 minutes. Sorry.
No, it was perfect. Thank you very much, Katie. Katie teaches for SANS, our Cyber Threat and Intelligence course, and is one of the leading threat analysts over at Red Canary, and we really appreciate her time joining us today. Next up, let's see if I can switch my own slides here. We have Mark Bristow. Now, Mark is one of these individuals that I had a privilege of meeting multiple years ago, listening to him to talk about security related to ICS. And he's one of our instructors for the ICS 515 class, which is incident response in ICS. Mark currently has a very unique perspective of leading several hunt teams for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And we're really blessed to be able to have him be able to present, in quote unquote uniform on behalf of both SANS and his current agency about how they're looking at SolarWinds as a whole. So I'm going to be handing over to Mark. You'll be at the edge of your seat with what he has to say. He's one of the leading experts, and I tend to really listen in when he's posting things about SolarWinds into the faculty chat when we're all sharing ideas of what's going on. Mark, all you.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks everybody for taking the time to be with me today. I think this is a really important topic, as I think that the supply chain compromise, and like Katie, SolarWinds is a name that we're trying to not use because of the breadth of this activity, is really interesting and highlights some risk points that I think that are things that maybe have gotten away from us as a community and things that we weren't necessarily considering in mass before. So I think that it's a really instructive case study, and I think there's a lot of really important lessons to be learned from this activity. And I'm happy to be here in my official capacity. Normally, if you've taken the class with me, I always say I'm here in my personal capacity, but I'm actually here as in my official capacity today to talk to you about the work that CISA is doing around this activity and get some lessons learned. And Rob, I can't seem to change slides. There we go. I don't know if I did that or you did. Either way, so what are some really key and important takeaways from all this activity? So the first thing that you have to realize about this activity is we're talking about a patient and resourceful adversary. The types of intrusions we're talking about and some of the things that Katie just talked about in her presentation really are long game activities. This is not a smash and grab ransomware type of threat actor. This is a threat actor that's patient, that's willing to breach supply chains, get into vendor environments, put malicious code in there, get it into positions so that it actually gets signed by their signing keys. So avoiding our typical defenses that we have around trust of software that we run in our environments. Really a lot of kind of deep long-term planning from the adversary here. I mean, if you think about this type of complicated operation, likely started years ago with intelligence collection and preparatory activity of the targets that they wanted to get into, even to identify SolarWinds as a potential, Orion as a potential supply chain target. So this is not your run-of-the-mill intrusion. This is kind of an intrusion of the higher order. But even with that really, truly advanced persistent threat adversary, still a lot of rudimentary intrusion techniques being effectively leveraged by them. And I'll get into more of that later as I move on. But can't stress that enough. It's a very patient, resourceful adversary here. And they were going after our supply chain in really in a very effective way. And I can't stress this enough. We use SolarWinds. I know this is the SolarWinds Lightning Summit. That's how everyone is referring to this activity. But in reality, it's not just SolarWinds. Our incident response engagements have found cases where there was not even SolarWinds installed in the environment that was actually compromised. So there's other methods of the adversary getting in. And it's likely, as Katie mentioned, that there were other supply chain software vendors that indicated that they had some level of involvement in this activity. So I don't think we've even gotten to the end of the rainbow on what supply chain vulnerabilities there were that were being used. The other challenge here is that the adversary is smart. Once they get that initial access, they're using that access to breach identity trust. And when you breach identity trust, it becomes very, very difficult for organizations to detect this activity. Ultimately, you have to have user behavioral analytics and other types of analytics about, where did the user log in from, or why is a user from the finance department accessing the threat intelligence platform. These types of analytics are very difficult to install in a typical organization. And it adds a lot of complexity to finding the activity beyond the initial compromise. And the adversary is moving very quickly from that to that position of actions on objectives. They're also targeting the incident responders. which adds a lot of complexity to this. One important question to ask yourselves: do you have an out-of-band practiced communication mechanism for your incident responders to even communicate that's not your primary IT platform? If you don't, the adversary is literally going to read their mail and outfox your defensive actions. So again, this adversary really thinking a lot about how to have a persistent impact in the environment. So let's go to timeline for just real quick. And I'm going to focus now just on the SolarWinds issue. And this is a chart out of the SolarWinds briefing on this topic. But if we look at this, the threat actor first accessed the SolarWinds environment at least in November. So this activity was going in 2019. So this activity went undetected for quite some time. They didn't actually deploy Sunburst until February. This is a long timeline of activity that, again, just reinforces that this is a persistent actor who is willing to deeply compromise these environments over the long haul to achieve their objectives. And if you think about this, SolarWinds Orion is a platform that is generally installed in big organizations, government agencies, Fortune 500 companies, et cetera, and is used to help manage networks. Well, because it's used to help manage networks, it becomes a great entry point into your environment because it has lots of highly privileged account credentials baked right into it so that it can do its function of managing the network. This makes it a really, really great target for this activity as an initial access vector to get into these environments. But you got to see this dwell time in SolarWinds. They were in there for a couple of months at least before they started taking these actions. Again, that's that patience, that well-resourced, that reconnaissance activity, which is where you want to be from a detection standpoint, is finding it there, not finding it after you see those actions on objectives. But I do, a lot of people have talked a lot about SolarWinds. Again, not calling this out as a SolarWinds issue, but I really want you to think about all of your vendors and trust. We put a lot of trust in our software supply chain, and we count a lot on code signing to validate that trust. And this is a perfect example of some of the weaknesses in our current trust mechanisms that can be exploited by the adversary. This code, when you downloaded it and installed it in your system, was signed. That is our principal flag that something might be amiss. So the adversary is exploiting the weaknesses in how we validate our software supply chain to get their effects operations. Again, it's certainly complicated activity, but at the end of the day, it's just a means to an end, right? And that's where identity comes into play. The SolarWinds supply chain compromise is a really interesting case study all by itself. But in reality, more interesting to me and more applicable more broadly is what happened after the compromise. And that was the adversary started going after identity providers. So what do I mean by that? So now, especially in the current climate with COVID, we're all doing this virtually, all broadcasting from homes all across the world. We suddenly had all of these users that were remotely logging in from places they didn't used to. And while we used to rely on things like firewalls and perimeters as our principal defenses, well, the firewall doesn't really have any impact in a globally distributed workforce. And so now identity becomes the thing that we count on for our security as the foundation of our security. This intrusion set specifically went after that identity activity to impersonate me in the environment or you in your environment, and then now had access to all the things you did. Then they went even further as compromising trust stores and what's called service principals. So the service accounts that manage your network did things like added additional security keys to those environments so that they can masquerade as those users. It is not uncommon to see these service accounts accessing lots of different systems in the environment. So it won't throw up any red flags to a lot of organizations that aren't monitoring for behavioral analytics. Again, a perfect way for the adversary to go undetected for quite some time. We're still backing out where we think this all started, but possibly even a year this could have been going on with no detections out there. So really a key technique that the adversary is using in compromising and exploiting identity trust throughout the environment. And then finally, they did even some really crafty things like adding whole new trust stores, adding an Active Directory server to your environment that's trusted. Now they can log in locally, get trust to your whole environment, and you have no logs and telemetry to see that it happened. Again, trying to hide from the defenders. So how can we find this, right? Like this is all doom and gloom. What can we actually do about this? right? Well, there's a lot of things that we can do. So I will say detecting a supply chain compromise and having full supply chain surety is something that is out of reach for most organizations. It is very, very hard to do a full comprehensive supply chain code reviews of every single binary you put in your system, lots of certification and checking. It's very, very difficult, right? So if you had this issue in your environment, don't feel bad. This was a very, very hard thing to identify pre-exploitation. But there were some things that you could do that would have illuminated that actions on objectives for you. Things like network baselining. Had you identified, why are we communicating with a new system on the internet? Why is the privileged user suddenly logging into the SharePoint site of the incident response team? Why is email suddenly being accessed from a Tor exit node? These types of behavioral analytics and anomalies are where organizations would be able to detect this type of activity without any pre-knowledge. One of the things that we get a lot of feedback for at CISA is there's not a lot of IOCs for this activity. Well, that's because there's not a lot of IOCs at the network level that really have a lot of meaning. The adversary is using specific command and control for each individual victim. It makes it very, very difficult to use our typical defensive technologies to identify this activity. And that's where this network baselining and user behavior baselining becomes so critical to identifying this activity. Some examples there, like impossible logins, like suddenly coming in from Washington, D.C., and then 5 minutes later from San Francisco. You can't have traveled that far in that period of time. Looking for abuse of tokens, which you may or may not be able to see. In some cases, your vendors don't provide the logging information you need to get that abuse telemetry. So it's something you got to work with those service providers and partners that you're working with, making sure you're getting the right logging. There's a lot of different ways to detect that. We put out a tool called Sparrow, which is one thing that helps you detect this activity, as well as the activity alert with kind of what we know on the case. But we're still working this. This is not over from a DHS perspective, and we continue to work this day in and day out. So I want to leave you with a couple of key questions to ask. Do you know who you trust? When was the last time you checked? If somebody added a domain controller to your environment, would you notice? Right? I talked to one government partner of mine who had 3,000 domain controllers. So it's very hard to validate that. I was like, well, we want to talk about network architecture maybe. Do you have the visibility you need to detect this activity in your hosted and cloud environments? Can you see all authentication attempts, such as valid logins? All of this activity comes up as a valid user login, right? So again, it's very hard to detect this. Do we have the right telemetry from our partners? If your network's compromised, can you operate and communicate? A lot of organizations are suddenly figuring out that oh, we need to call each other on Signal and those types of things, right? Do you have an OPSEC plan? When's the last time you executed your disaster recovery plan? All of these things are really key questions. And if you're not impacted by this today, start asking these questions of your organization so that when you get hit by something similar tomorrow, you're going to be ready. And then it's clicking over there. I got some links in here. We'll make sure we share that. But we have a page for just the supply chain compromise at CISA where you can get all the things I talked about. Really excited to talk to you about this today. And thanks very much. Really looking forward to your questions. And thanks for SANS for putting this on.
Thanks, Mark. That was incredibly insightful, and I really appreciate you and our agency willing to come and present on their behalf and also be a part of SANS. Thank you. Next up, there's a lot of key takeaways when it comes to the malware analysis, and our speaker, Evan, is one of the individuals that has been tracking a variety of the malware samples since day zero, when a lot of folks had them online. As you can see in his list of courses that he's able to teach, he is one of the leading experts at SANS when it comes to not only malware analysis, but incident response, threat hunting, and network detection as a whole. We asked him to come on board and really talk about what he saw when he was going through the code samples and samples that were found online. So Evan, glad to have you here. Let's see what you have to say.
Okay, thanks, Rob. So as you can tell, I've taught a number of classes for SANS. Most recently, I've been teaching 4610, 6503, and 402 for the cybersecurity writing. All very fun classes to teach. And hopefully the mouse is going to work for me. There we go. So I have three main goals with this presentation. I want to show that actually doing the malware analysis yourself is going to give you the best source of knowledge for understanding what happened with this sample. It will also help you to figure out how would you detect this kind of traffic in the future, not just for this sample, but for other future malware samples that do similar actions. This is some of the behavior that you can detect. We have some pretty good tools that are free that allow us to do that. Then I also want you to see how that DNS traffic that was been mentioned before can be decoded, because without that malware analysis, without reverse engineering that code, it's very difficult to figure out what is happening with those DNS requests that this sample is sending out. First step, of course, is you do your triage. And I got a copy of that DLL very early on. It was also in that Microsoft patch file that was still publicly available on the SolarWinds website for several days after this incident began. So I was able to get a copy of that as well. It was very obvious very quickly that this sample is not, it's very suspicious. It's not a benign sample. There's many obfuscated strings. There's a little bit of code obfuscation, but not a lot. But when you figured out how to decode the strings are base64 encoded versions of compressed strings. So they did 2 levels of encoding. And when you decoded those, they were clearly suspicious. They had WMI queries and that sort of thing in them. Also, there was these long lists of numbers, and they claimed to be in the code that they were timestamps. They clearly were not timestamps. If you try to convert them into a timestamp to decode the timestamps, it clearly did not work at all. So the main function that runs is this Orion improvement business layer .initialize. It runs every time the inventory manager refresh function runs, and it's basically every 24 hours, but it's configurable. So take that with a grain of salt a little bit. It does perform various checks before the malware does the core functionality. If it does not pass those checks, then the core functionality does not run. There are various reports about one of those checks that is a delay check. And generally those reports have been incorrect. And I want to show you why that is so. So it was widely reported that there's a delay of 12 to 14 days. That is absolutely correct. But where does the delay start? Does it start from the installation on the victim machine? What about the compilation date? Or what is this date? Well, it was actually measured from the last modified date of the DLL. But what is that date? So if you look in the code, you'll see it gets the last write time of that DLL, and then it counts 12 to 14 days from that date. But what is that date? Well, this is the copy that, one of the copies I got. I actually was able to look at a number of different organizations' copies of this DLL. This is just one of them. You'll see that modified date is March 24th of 2020. Question is that a modified date or is that an installation date? Looking deeper into that executable, there's a couple of things you can look at. The first thing I looked at was the signing time. Was it on the same date? And sure enough, it's on March 24th, 2020. So the date it was signed and the modification date were the same. You can also look at additional metadata and see the compile time inside that executable, also the same date. And so that delay is measuring from the compile date and time. So that delay is not from the date of installation, but of compilation. And the installation process preserves that compilation date as the last modified date. So why do we care? Well, because number one, the delay doesn't protect that backdoor from sandboxes. A lot of places reported that it would take 12 to 14 days before the sandbox would actually be able to run it. That actually is not true. It's very unlikely that you would be getting that code installed on your system within 12 to 14 days of the compilation date. So there's other checks that it makes to anti-analysis tools and so on. Those might be running and it might not run for those reasons, but it will not, the delay does not stop it from running in your sandbox. Also, you can't assume that if you've only had that malware on your system for a few days, that it didn't run because that 12 to 14 day delay is not active. We don't know if it's a bug. Maybe they intended for it to be after installation. Maybe they just meant it to keep from running during the QA period. Unsure. I lean towards the side that probably was a bug simply because they seem to be pretty good in other areas, but maybe this was a little bug. Maybe they hadn't taken the Forensics 508 or Forensics 500 to find out that they really need to double check what the modified date is. In this case, malware analysis and forensic analysis for the win in this case, because it gives us a more clear picture of what that sample is doing. This malware also disabled some services, and it did this in a very simple way. It changed the registry, changing the start value to 4, which disabled the service. Those changes don't take effect until that machine gets restarted. Sysmon is one of the tools, free tool from Microsoft. They can monitor for those kinds of changes. If you're not monitoring for those changes now, this is a wake-up call. You need to start doing it now. This is something that's really easy to do. It's very high true positive rate. You have to just narrow it down to monitoring certain keys in the registry that have to do with services should not have been changed. And so this is one of those things that's an actionable item that you can use now to start monitoring immediately. Another SANS course, 511, is awesome for doing this kind of continuous monitoring. Then the DNS traffic was interesting because there are a number of scripts out there that didn't quite get it. They came really close and they got probably good enough for a lot of reasons, but we decided we wanted to have a more clear picture and find out what was happening. So we discovered that we had to reverse engineer the code from scratch really to get this decoding correct. It took up to 16 DNS requests sometimes to transfer long host or domain names. And here's the data that shows up in those DNS requests once you decode them. You can see a host ID, which identifies that host uniquely. There's a timestamp. The encoded host domain name is actually just a part of it. And then you have to glue all those requests together to get the full host or domain name. Also there you have the installed or running status of the security products. It's just a status to say, here's what's running. It actually reported back on 8 different products and then continued. And then unless the different products were not running, this sample would not continue running. Then there's also this request to response. We're not really sure because we don't have visibility into that second stage or the third stage because the C2 server was already down at that point. So that's one of the limitations of malware analysis. Quite often the C2 server will already be gone. So conclusions, use that malware analysis, understand that malware, combine it with your digital and network forensics, and you will have much more leverage and much deeper understanding of what that sample is doing than if you just did malware analysis by itself. Do your own analysis if you possibly can, because you're going to find things that maybe are important to you that weren't important to other analysts. It's not just that they missed something, it's just maybe it wasn't important to them, but it may be important to you in your organization. And you just might be surprised what you find. And I've got a few references there. The last one in particular is very interesting because it has all of the hashes and all of the obfuscated scripts decoded for you already. I was very happy to find that that guy did that. And so, Rob, it's back to you.
Thank you. Just a couple of housekeeping tips. We're halfway through the summit. We have just a reminder as you are going through the talks, if you have any questions for that speaker or the panelists in general, please put them in Q&A. And at the end of the last half of the summit, we are going to go back to all the speakers, and we're going to answer a lot of questions. We have a lot of great questions already. Just as a note that the slides and presentations will be posted after we are completed with the event. And many of the presentations will also find themselves on YouTube a bit later as well. Our next speaker that we have is a really good friend of mine. I've known him for multiple years, and he's one of these individuals that really sits between both worlds, between digital forensics, incident response, and offensive operations and penetration testing. Mike Murr is one of the few individuals that I honestly think speaks both languages fluently. He is one of the best hackers, the red teamers I know on the planet. That he's coded his own exploits. He understands how that entire sequence of operations work through the entire attack operations methodologies that are out there. And Mike also happens to be one of the best digital forensics and investigators that we have at SANS. He's also one of our co-authors of our leading incident response course, Security 504. Without further ado, I'm going to be handing over the controls to Mike Murr. Go ahead, Mike.
Wow, okay, thanks, Rob. In case my face isn't ready enough already, so welcome, my name is Mike Murr. And with that, let's go ahead and get started talking about some of the best and worst approaches that we've seen organizations take when dealing with the SolarWinds incident from an incident response perspective. By the way, the names from the victim organizations have been removed, and everything that we have seen has been seen at multiple different victims, so it's not just one. We've also kind of removed the names to help save some embarrassing moments here. So some things that are happening that aren't working. We will talk about some things that are working as well. But first and foremost is the fact that sometimes people say, we don't have anything to worry about. We're not running SolarWinds. Well, that may be a true statement. However, there are many aspects to this, as many speakers have said so far. It's, for instance, what about your supply chain? Where along the people that you work with, do any of them run SolarWinds? And as was mentioned, there was I want to say it was Wall Street Journal article came out a few days ago, where they publicly said, the head of US CISA said that 30% of the victims involved in this campaign had no direct relation to SolarWinds. What this means is SolarWinds was not the only entry point. So even if you don't run SolarWinds and somehow miraculously SolarWinds was nowhere in your supply chain, which is unlikely, but let's pretend for discussion, there's still 30% of the victims, both private sector and government, that SolarWinds was not the initial entry point. So we have that from one perspective. Another problem is just ignoring a problem altogether. Sometimes businesses will say something to the effect of, well, we're not a target. Why would whatever threat actors behind this or threat actors, why would they want to target us? The issue comes from a little bit deeper perspective on things in terms of it's not just the fact of that specific business. That specific business may not have been a direct target, but the access that business provides and what that business is able to enable for an adversary, for a threat actor, may have significantly more value than the infrastructure of that business itself. Plus, when you're talking about something like this, realize, and this has been said before, that this is not just some type of ransomware, smash and grab type of thing. This was quite largely an act of espionage. And when it comes to espionage, long-term, long game really is the key. So whereas the compromises that happen today and the vulnerabilities that were exposed may not be used or utilized right away, they may come in value maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now. Now, another thing that we had, well, one victim was actually said this, they will remain unnamed. They said they weren't concerned because they don't update their production software. Well, they have bigger problems, needless to say. Now, of the organizations that are responding, one thing that we're seeing that's not working as effectively as it could is the idea of improper scoping. Really kind of sums things up. So they patch, they're done. They find an implant, remove the implant, they're done. They block a domain or associated domains, they're done. The problem isn't with what they're doing. That's good. All of those actions are definitely good. However, it's stopping at that point. Now, part of the reason that we kind of see a lot of this, some of these misconceptions and inactions are because of the fact that many organizations don't really think about the entire infrastructure and what goes into their business, because any business, large, small, etc., has several components to it. Obviously, every organization has their own network infrastructure and all of that good stuff, but they've also got business partners. They've got people that they depend on, or organizations that they work with, just as those business partners will have some of their own relations and so on and so forth. Likewise, that your organization probably also has vendors, people who supply whether it's software or something to that organization, some service or good, what have you. Then the relations also go in the other direction. Your business has customers who may also very well have their own customers, some of which may overlap and stuff like that. First of all, SolarWinds, there's a good chance the SolarWinds Orion software was used somewhere throughout that trust relationship. And number two, realize that there are a few things to look at this. First of all, these interactions, these relations that you have with whether it's organization, business partners, vendors, customers, etc. These are also dependencies. That means your business or some aspect of your business depends upon something from one of these entities. And the second thing that's not always apparent is that these relationships are reciprocal. Just as you depend on your vendors to your customers, you are a vendor. Now, when you look at both of these kind of in totality, what this is suggesting is that it becomes a little bit more apparent how vulnerabilities anywhere in the system become your business liabilities. That's really the key concern here. Even if you're in an organization that's not focused on the technical components and threat attribution and all that good stuff, right? If you're just focused on the response component, because there are many organizations that understandably are focused on just that, realize that the vulnerabilities of the entire system are your business liabilities. And really to summarize that previous slide and talk about a kind of a perspective shift that does work, is to realize that your risk boundary or your organizational risk boundary is not your network boundary. So what this means is starting to think in terms of things like business ecosphere. So as you're evaluating risk, ask what are all of the components for a business that pose risk, not just our network. The network and related infrastructure is important. So for example, ask yourself, what type of risk do your vendors pose? Even something as simple as if the vendor went out of business, which may not have any malicious idea behind it, right? What would happen to our business? How would things be negatively impacted? Similarly, when it comes to vendors, another thing to think about is, do any of your vendors or business partners or even potential customers have any data that could cause your business to incur a liability? Realize that when we talk about infrastructure and security, data is also a huge concern here. And even though that SolarWinds wasn't the target of this, realize that from a business owner's perspective or business management perspective, the liability of someone else who has your data that has been compromised or the potential to be compromised can be very unsettling. Also, in a similar reciprocal manner, think about who are you a vendor to? Who does your business provide services or organizations? Who are your customers? Because they, A, are a liability to you, but also B, your organization may be a liability to them. Another organizational shift that we've seen help quite a bit is to basically plan for compromise. This doesn't mean stop trying to prevent incidents at all. No, you should still definitely go do as best you can with the resources you have available to help implement preventative measures, but realize nothing's going to stop everything. And one of the things that SolarWinds really highlights is the idea of a single point of failure. If you think about it, the adversaries were able to effectively gain domain administrative privileges and then use those to acquire tokens to persist in the environment or maintain their level of access. A good friend of mine described an analogy as kind of like the Costco warehouse, which is a membership warehouse where you have to pay an annual fee to be a member, and then you can purchase goods in bulk and stuff like that. And he said it's kind of like flashing a credit card instead of your Costco card to get in the door. Once you get in, you can have as many free samples as you want. And I think that really demonstrates the issue quite clearly, because as soon as you get past that one single point of failure, in the case of Costco, for example, using a credit card, and it's possible I've done that by accident. I actually have a Costco card, and I one time actually flashed a credit card. I was like, oh, whoops. But this really does demonstrate that with a single point of failure, after that point, everything becomes a free game. So some exercises. Start trying to do tabletop exercises and discussing how you would deal with some of these impossible scenarios. One of the things that many organizations have thought was no one will be able to get domain admin or be able to persist in our environment that long. Well, very little is actually impossible by a determined adversary with enough funding and enough smart minds. Also, ask your upper management what would cause your business to fail. not just your network, obviously, we're all focusing on that, but what types of things would cause your business to fail from a business process perspective. And the reason I mention this is because one of the key things here is that legitimate business processes were attacked and exploited. The adversary took advantage of in this case, what was effectively network management and remote monitoring software. And many organizations use that for a legitimate purpose. So now what this means is, from a response perspective, you have to roll out a large corporate-wide rollout, a change, a huge corporate-wide shift. So you need to treat it like any long-term IT project. I mean, it's not going to be an overnight fix. It's not going to be something that's not disruptive, meaning you will be disrupting regular business operations because things have to change. So plan like you would any corporate-wide rollout. A few specifics that work. First of all, knowing your environment. So we're not talking about just hardware, but software, as well as not just the stuff that you've installed, but the stuff that has been installed by your vendors. And very importantly, your versions of what's there and the configurations of your software and the changes that have been made. For example, one organization had a domain controller installed at an offsite that the InfoSec team did not know about. Once they did find out, they weren't able to respond. They didn't have the resources to respond appropriately. Similarly, another organization had ADFS installed in their environment, unbeknown to them, because it came from a vendor. I know knowing your network is not an easy task and is a constantly changing effort, but attackers will know it. In fact, to quote Rob Joyce, who gave a talk called Disrupting Nation-State Hackers. Rob Joyce worked for NSA's TAO, and the talk was effectively stating that NSA's TAO, acting as United States nation-state hackers, he said, this is what businesses can do to make our life more difficult. And he said, our job, our key to success as nation-state hackers is to know the network, is knowing that network better than the people who set it up. So if the attackers are going to be taking that much time to know your network, you need to do it yourself. Also making sure that you log, especially DNS. In this, with this set of malware specimens, DNS was especially critical for identification and detection. Also, as a corollary to this, making sure you can access logs. Some of the problems that we've run into, high volume logs, so those where there's lots of log traffic, age very quickly. Also, with the shift to everything with many things being cloud nowadays for various different reasons, being able to access those logs becomes a different story, especially if you're using Office 365 and Microsoft Azure. Not saying that it's completely impossible, but the process and procedures you go through to access logs when your infrastructure is hosted in Azure will be different than if your infrastructure is hosted locally. All right, these are references which will be available. I believe the slides will be available for download as well. And thank you. That's it. Back to you, Rob.
All right, Mike, really appreciate your time and joining us today. There's so many takeaways from these talks. It just, I can't wait till the end of the panel. So if you have any questions or, thoughts you'd like to share with the panelists, please put them in the Q&A. Next up, we have our curriculum lead for Blue Team here at SANS, our very own John Hubbard, who has authored our Blue Team Fundamentals class, Security 450. John's one of these individuals that I've been working with for multiple years now. He has one of the most amazing podcasts online. If you haven't listened to it, I'm sure he's going to talk about it real quick and how to link to it. But it's called The Blueprint. And I think they're gearing up for season 2 that's coming out, but he basically interviews a lot of folks in the Blue Team community. But we get a lot of questions at SANS about what are some of the fundamentals that may have helped prevent help detect the SolarWinds and SolarWinds type intrusions a little bit better, and what are some of the key takeaways. So John, handing over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Rob. Yes, so excuse me. As Rob said, I am the course author for Blue Team Fundamentals, a new course called Management 551, which is building and leading security operations centers. I teach some of the other Blue Team courses, 511, 555. So SOC, security operations, and blue teaming is my wheelhouse. So I was very excited to get the chance to do this discussion here. And yes, Blueprint season 2 is going to be coming out this quarter. So if you are a listener, thank you very much. And if you're not yet, check it out. I'm going to have 10 more episodes at least. What I wanted to do in this brief 10 minutes here is take a look at, if you are working in a SOC, what are some of the opportunities you might have had to catch this style of compromise? This was a very, very difficult thing to try to catch, right? it caught a lot of us by surprise because of some of the things we talked about before. The delivery vector was a trusted supplier. Are you going to catch that? Are you going to be verifying their software and even know if it's changed in a meaningful way? Probably not, right? The execution that they were using was a very tricky kind of live off the land, use some legitimate tools or semi-legitimate tools. They were using and leveraging malicious scripts and DLL files. Their command and control was very, very well hidden. Their exfil was done in a pretty, I would say, standard, but still sneaky and hard to catch sort of way. And in general, the really interesting thing about this, which made it nearly impossible for many people to catch in a kind of standardized way across the globe, is that everything was unique, like literally everything. The file names were different, right? The domain names were different. The folder names they put the backdoor in, they were all different. And so what can we do to even go against an adversary that has operational security at this level? It's kind of a hard thing to think about if you're not familiar with all the different variables and things that you can potentially record as a SOC. And so in these set of slides, I want to go through a whole bunch of stuff. I'm going to talk about some things specific to this compromise, but all of these things really apply to like any compromise, right? We're going to go with this in general and say like, what is it, regardless of how tricky it was delivered to you, right? Supply chain or otherwise, what is it about these situations that we can still latch onto? The one thing I want to make a point about on these is every compromise has something about it that is an anomaly. And if you see that anomaly or not, that may be the thing that makes a difference for if you're going to catch the problem, and especially when it comes to these things. So you'll see a lot of what I'm going to talk about is looking at for what is unique and hasn't happened before. And so with that, let's dive into a few of these things. First one is living off the land and legitimate binaries or semi-legitimate binaries, depending on how you look at them. I'm going to touch on living off the land in a second, but legitimate binaries, right? There was this tool used called AD-Find, which is a tool by Joeware, which is a way to query Active Directory. And we see it used by IT admins conceivably, but it's a pretty old tool. And we also see it used in human-operated ransomware compromises, as well as things like this. And so if I'm aware that AD-Find is a tool that commonly gets used, well, okay, as a SOC, let's just put in a block list item for AD-Find and tell me if this ever gets seen anywhere by hash, right? By name, by the install location. There's a whole bunch of different ways we can look at this and just say, tell me if this is here, because most of us won't even probably have it. And if you do have it, well, then how do we still catch it? Let's look at who normally runs it and who doesn't normally run it. We have a new person running AD-Find. Okay, this is a tactic that works for all tools, right? It's not AD-Find specific. Anything that is kind of a dual use executable. So this can be PSExec or any of those kind of tools that admins might use, but when non-admins use them, then it becomes highly suspicious. Or let's say what they did in this case. AD-Find was renamed and put into a non-standard location, but to my understanding, they did not change the actual program. Well, if you have an executable and you know the hash of it and you want to know when it's running, you could set an alert that says, tell me when the hash of AD-Find is being ran. And then it goes off and it says, hey, someone ran AD-Find. You look at the file and it's in a different folder. It's not called AD-Find. That's highly, highly suspicious. And so that's kind of more specific to this case, but it works really for anything, right? Adversaries might try to avoid you catching them by renaming things, but the hash doesn't change. If the hash does change, maybe you can catch it by name. There's opportunities there, right? We're looking for unique executables being run that have never been run before that might be suspicious or malicious. And we're looking for them per person, per host it ran on, really anything, right? Other things. We have them doing bypassing of application control and things like that by running scripts and using DLLs with run DLL32 and things like that that can get around maybe app locker protection and those sorts of things. So Sunburst, for example, that was kind of that second stage. It would drop a VBS script. The VBS script would then potentially drop a DLL, which was really Cobalt Strike. Well, how do we catch these kinds of things? We can apply application control to DLLs. Right now, it's kind of tricky to do, but it can be done. And even if you're not controlling it, half of the problem, maybe 90% of the problem, is just knowing that a new DLL ran from a new location that you have never seen before. Now, are you going to respond to every single one of those in your organization? Probably not. But if you see unique DLL on a machine where we also have had unique programs run for the first time, and other suspicious activity, all of these low fidelity indicators start to build up and become one high fidelity, really weird detection. And so although none of them in a vacuum might be enough to get your interest, when you're aggregating your alerts by host and you see all these tiny questionable things happening in the same spot, now it becomes something to pay a lot more attention to. So scripting, right? We can look at scripts. VBS scripts are run under the WScript executable. You have process command line creation recorded. You can absolutely see someone ran a new script for the first time. Where is it running from? How many other machines are running the same script? Oh, it's just this one user and this one machine one time? A little bit suspicious. Add it in with the other things. You may be able to catch this sort of thing as well. What about persistence? They were using WMI filters and WMI events that you could record with things like Sysmon. Again, a tricky thing to do, but it is very possible. The one that I thought was a little bit easier was actually the registry-based persistence mechanism that they used. What they did was they changed a registry key known to control image file execution options, which is basically a way that you can list, hey, Windows, when you run this program, also run this other program so we can use it as a debugger. Well, they made the DLL that other program so it would constantly boot up and it would kind of unchain it from other stuff that was going on in the system. Well, if you see anyone create one of these registry keys, that's immediately suspicious, right? You can trigger an audit event when a registry key gets written into the place in the registry where these things are noted, right? You can turn on Windows Object Access Auditing and you can get a 4657 event ID in your security log that says someone just made a new change to your registry. And the same thing works for files as well, for like the startup folder. You can, in the SOC, get an active alert every single time someone starts or someone drops a new auto start extensibility point of any kind through those kind of mechanisms. And so let's say that goes off and you're like, I don't even know what this means, right? I don't know what IFEO is. I don't know what this program is. All right, is it suspicious or not? Well, how many other machines have done this exact same thing? None. Okay, suspicious plus plus, right? And now, of course, you still have to dig and dig and dig, but again, combined with the other things, now we're building up a case for something very highly suspicious has occurred here because we're changing registry keys, we're running stuff we've never run before. All of these things piling up together can be directly monitored, compared against their population and say, did anything else do this? Even if you don't know if it's good or bad, that's context that tells you something at least unique is happening here. And as we know, all compromises are unique, but not all unique things are compromises. So it's still a little work you got to do, but you continue to stack stuff up. All right, defense evasion. They were living off the land with built-in Windows commands. They were using AuditPaul to disable logging. Do you have a way of detecting when someone disables logging on your machines? I would hope so, right? And so right off the bat, just having some kind of host intrusion prevention system or EDR or something, just looking at the Windows logging service or looking at commands being run, anything trying to run AuditPaul and turn off security logging, right? Highly, highly suspicious. Firewall rules being modified with the netsh command. How many of your users know what the netsh command is and might run one of those things one day, right? Almost nobody. The system might run some of those commands, but the system commands that are run as part of your scripts or whatever are probably going to be the same across all your systems. These are going to be unique. So again, uniqueness, anomalies. These things show up over and over and over again. Even if you don't know what you're looking for, anomalies can help get you there in the right direction. So that's what we're looking for in that case. We get baseline tools, we look at changes, we use our security endpoint suites to say, hey, show me when these key configuration items change and tell me if something important has happened here. Yes, I did say event 4657. That's the one that will tell you if registry values have been modified. Windows Object Access Auditing. This one, really important. Okay, command and control. We have a domain generation algorithm. The point of a domain generation algorithm is you can't preemptively say, look for this site because it's always changing. Well, they actually had to happen to have a parent website that was always going to be the same, at least for part of it, this AVSM cloud thing. Then the first two pieces would change a little bit. How do we catch that if we don't know anything about it going in? Well, there's a couple different ways we can go about it. First, this is a domain that you have never been to in your organization ever before. No one's ever been there, right? So there's one idea. Now, that's not something you're going to go to every day because, yes, someone is doing that every day probably. But let's look at some other variables here. Is this unique to a single machine? Okay, in this case, maybe that one single compromised SolarWinds install was the only thing calling out to it. All right, so new domain on a single machine going to a domain that has an unknown reputation, because at the beginning of this, no one had ever seen this before. So if you Googled AVSM Cloud, you'd get nothing. That is highly suspicious. If it were a good service going to a vendor, someone would have said something about it. What about entropy? Well, we have entropy in the subdomain. And so if you can programmatically look for random appearing characters, especially ones that change, you can not only catch this, but you can catch things like DNS tunneling, where there'll be thousands of requests with changing items. One of the things I always point out in my classes is for DNS tunneling, and it would probably work for these as well if you had a changing subdomain, is if you look at your DNS logs, as we just said were important, you could say, sort all of the domains people are going to by the count of unique subdomains underneath that parent domain. How many different subdomains do various parent level domains typically have? Most of them are not that many. Now, like Cloudflare and stuff like that might have a lot, but we know who Cloudflare is. So you sort it, you make that list, you say AVSM is at the top. Well, what's that? There's no information about it. Our threat intel vendor hasn't seen it before. All these things are changing. This is highly suspicious, and combined with all of our other evidence, brings us in the right direction. Exfil, they were taking files, they were putting those files into 7-zip archives, they were encrypting the archives and breaking them up into small pieces. This is an exfil pattern I have seen for years and years and years. So what do we do about this? We know the tool they use might be 7-zip, so we can look directly like for 7-zip, like we do with AD find. Look for it by hash, look for it by file name, look for it by path, look for the command line parameters being used with it. I have seen 7-zip used before that was renamed, but the command line parameters were the same. So it was fake name.exe and then the -p or whatever it is to make a password, and then all the files going into it, and then all of that kind of compacting of all the stuff that they were later going to steal, right? If you're looking for these command lines and any evidence of 7-zip being used from a command line, which most people don't do, that's another place that you can potentially look for evidence of exfiltration. Alternate names, non-standard locations, all this stuff stacks up. So ultimately, what is the approach here? This is what I would recommend for everyone for every compromise, right? Regardless of whether it's SolarWinds or something else. Think about, as a blue team, if you know about a tool that is potentially used for bad, what do you know about it? What do you know it's going to be called? Where will it be installed? What's the hash? Who's it signed by? Write detections to highlight when that thing is used, right? This is the AD find approach, PS exec, and things like that. You want to know if people are using it. Some people will use it. So you take those people out and you say the first time they ever use it, call them up, right? Hey, user, did you use this? Yes, I use that as part of my job. Cool, you're off the list. Everyone else that uses it for the first time, you're going to catch it. And especially if any of those details have been modified, you almost immediately know that it's malicious if someone has renamed AD find, right? What about the stuff you don't know? We are looking for anomalies. Every compromise has anomalies. The question is, will you see those anomalies as anomalies? To do that, you have to collect the right data. You have to take that data in and enrich it and parse it in ways that actually help you find that stuff. And then you have to recognize you were looking at one of these compromises. There's a whole bunch of really cool stuff. I wanted to point anyone to that was wanting to dig deeper into these things. The Microsoft blog post I have there, just go to sec450.com/sunburst. It's just a redirect to the Microsoft blog post. Deep dive on this malware. You can go a lot deeper on all these slides. So that's all I have. Thank you very much. Hopefully I gave you some good ideas there.
John, that was amazing. I really appreciate your time putting all those very actionable and useful takeaways in these slides. And again, we're going to be posting the slides and the presentations online immediately following this, after we obviously have to process them, and you'll find them on YouTube in addition back at the SANS website. Our final speaker, and again, if you have any questions, if you want to post them in the SANS Q&A before we kick off the final speaker, and we'll close out with the panel till the top of the half hour. But Dr. Johannes Orwick is one of our leading analysts inside SANS, been tracking threats for 20 years at SANS. He's one of these individuals that has seen everything going back to the coronavirus all the way down to every single incident since that point. He manages and leads the Internet Storm Center. And if you have not gone to the Internet Storm Center site, I highly recommend you do so. It's one of the most trafficked locations on the SANS website on a daily basis. So whenever there's an emergency webcast and we have to get quick analysis on something that's going on out there, including what had happened with SolarWinds, Dr. Johannes Ulrich is one of the individuals that we've always turned to at SANS to help lead that for us. I asked him specifically, what do you think that this is going to mean going forward? What do you think the impacts that the cybersecurity industry should potentially have as takeaways? And he immediately said, I want that topic. I really want to lead this. So I'm really interested to hear his thoughts on this, especially considering his vast background in leading the Internet Storm Center for SANS over all these years. Dr. J, it's all you. Uh-oh. I don't think we could hear you.
Yeah, no, sorry. I had my microphone still off. Good old, still on mute. But anyway, so there are a couple of things here that came together with this particular incident, and that's that we had this advanced adversary. It was a supply chain attack, which has really been sort of haunting us the last few years. These have become bigger and bigger. And then the very long dwell time of the attacker until the attack actually was made public. And to put a little bit of good spin on this entire incident is, I believe there are quite a few people in some country that are very unhappy because this infrastructure was taken from them. That really sort of gave them enormous insight into a lot of organizations. Now, I want to wrap this up here a little bit from perspective of the two classes I'm teaching. So I call myself a little bit a split stack personality. I'm sort of work on the application layer as well as network layer here with the intrusion detection and the defending web application class. But anyway, so the supply chain aspect of this attack, when we talk about the supply chain, we always envision well, sort of a linear process where we have people that write software tools, then developers that use these software tools, and well, in the end, users that use them. That's not really how it works. We really have this very messy supply network. And earlier I saw in the chat scroll by from someone in the audience who basically was saying, hey, it's complex, it's hard. It's hard to figure out who are your suppliers and also who are you supplying to. I put SANS in the mix here. You may not consider SANS as a supplier, but how many of you are running virtual machines that you received as part of a SANS class? Yes, certainly, and we are aware of our responsibility here as well to make sure that we give you malware as part of the malware analysis class, but we know what malware to give you. And that's really a big part of software development. And that supply chain responsibility is know what you have and know what you are providing to your customers. The other thing, and this is sort of something that SCOTUS always points out, we're sort of always focused on these nation state attacks. And then when you're looking at something like SolarWinds, you say, hey, I'm not creating software that manages networks of Fortune 500s all around the world. I'm not really a target here. One of the big lessons over time has been that these very advanced attacks, they sort of trickle down the food chain. When was it? 5-6 years ago, we had sort of some big attacks against large companies that basically overrode UEFI biases and such, and basically bricked machines. Well, last year, TrickBot, one of the most popular sort of mass market piece of malware, added components like that to it. So inevitably, the attacks that you're seeing against these more advanced targets, they're going to show up this year, next year, as part of sort of these mass market exploits. And So get ahead of it now before they hit you in the network. And of course, now it's always easy to say, hey, I'm not a target. You never really know because that's the other part of this. They're going after the weakest link in this supply chain network. And sadly, you may be it. You may be providing one component to a company like SolarWinds that they will use now in order to exfiltrate that network, and you're really just a stepping stone. You're that weak link that's then being used as part of a larger compromise. So how do you detect it? I think John had some really good points here, of course, and what I really want to emphasize is people often focus too much on these indicators of compromise, like specific domain names, specific file hashes. They're notoriously late. Even if you have a real great vendor that provides you with feeds like this, these are best case yesterday's IOCs. Like I mentioned, the people are very unhappy because they lost sort of this foothold into SolarWinds, but they also lost sort of their command control infrastructure because now everybody is looking for these particular domain names. Well, they move on. Today, they'll probably use a different domain name, and that's the domain name that you really have to find. I just want to point out here, and also John was pointing a little bit of to DNS. If you ask me, the one log I think that gives the one source of logs that gives you the biggest bang for the buck is your DNS logs these days, particularly if you're looking at network logs. Seek, I think, as one open source tool that really sort of gave you great insight in this case. And that's sort of the one case how these indicators of compromise can be helpful. If you can go back a few days, a few months and say, hey, have you seen this domain name in the past? Because that's where you'll see it, and that's where it'll matter. So keep those logs. It's more than just adding this to your rules and looking from now on forward. And that's the other problem sometimes. People sort of overload their sensors. Like I think I see that with IDSs with very specific rules that they will not trigger because that particular infrastructure no longer exists. So avoid that. Look more for behavior. And the tools like Seek are often more powerful there than of your classic IDSs that, like Snort or such, that just look more for specific signatures. That's not usually what you're really after. And then, of course, at the same note, share. Share what you're seeing because it changes all the time. Just today, actually, Rob mentioned at Storm Center, Boyan, one of our handlers, he was involved in an incident recently that he was dealing with, that he analyzed. And the attacker there actually used the synchronization mechanism for extension that's built into Google Chrome to exchange data as command control channel. So it changes all the time. They're using your own tools against you. These sort of living off the land. It's no longer just netstat and such. It's your browser. It's the communication protocols being built into the browser. So how do we prevent the next SolarWinds? Detecting, how do we prevent it? One thing, if you're writing software, that I would really emphasize is this idea of a software bill of materials. It's gaining some traction even in the regulatory environment, like with medical instruments and aviation and such, where this is sort of really being more emphasized. But try to know what you're building. I'm a developer, and I know myself. Stack Overflow, NPM or Pi, the different pip. Those are my main tools. Software is written by duct taping libraries together. Keep track of those libraries, keep track of those tools, and know what you're building and what you're using to build it. So if that particular vulnerability is being announced, well, you know what it is, and test those libraries. Run some static code analysis on it. Yes, I have no idea if SolarWinds would have detected it or not. And they may not have, but give it at least a try. It's not that hard. It's not that expensive to run some of your security tools on these components that you're including in your software. And well, with that, I hope I made up a little bit time that we have time for questions here. We have a bunch of good questions. I'll hand it back over to Rob here for the Q&A.
All right, all the speakers could come back online. We'll just stop the share and just go to turn on videos, and we'll kick this off as best we can for the time that we have remaining. So thanks everyone for putting your presentations together. There are so many amazing and really good, thoughtful, actionable takeaways that we're able to see from this. And again, for all the attendees that are currently listening in, we do have the slides and presentations will be ready for review immediately following these talks. So the first thing, I have a couple of questions that I get hit on a lot from a aspect of, just the average person, even in my neighborhood, everyone knows about SolarWinds because it's, widely discussed in the national media across the board. So there's a lot of things that you're trying to filter through from that aspect. So my question to everyone is, now that the media has this on high coverage, what is, an example or a way that the media is getting you to nod and say spot on? That's an excellent way to refer to that. And at the same sentence, where has the media gone wrong? And what is causing eye rolls when you hear the media mention something? So kind of, where they spot on, it says, yes, please say that more. And where does it cause an eye roll? So I'm gonna start with Mike Murr, and then depending on where you're at. So I'm gonna be calling randomly here. So what are they getting right, and where do you start to eye roll a little bit?
Ooh, that's kind of a tough one. I'm gonna have to pass on that for just at the moment, actually.
All right, no worries. Someone else ready to go? Okay, Katie, you're ready.
Got one. I got a great one actually. Lily Hay Newman from Wired reached out to me this week, and I'll drop a link to her article in the chat. She wrote a really thoughtful piece about like the third-party software concern overall. And I think that I loved her take on this because I think it's a lot of the things we've talked about here, like Johanna's finishing up with, like, how do we prevent the next one? And so, her subheading is a reminder of the ways interconnectedness can go wrong. And so I love that she wasn't just focused on, the tactical things, the SolarWinds compromise, the attribution. It was sort of a thoughtful take looking at the overall ecosystem. So Lily did a great job. So I'd give a +1 to that piece.
Any eye rolls from the national media that you see that you're just like, oh, please stop describing it that way?
I mean, my usual rant is on the focus on APTs or the state sponsorship, which in this case, like, yeah, we probably care if it's Russia and or China or both. But yeah, I always want to see less focus on the who behind the keyboard, because for many organizations, this is a question that came in. I think it doesn't actually matter if it's Russia, maybe. You can implement, the tactics, techniques, all the detection opportunities we've talked about today, regardless of knowing who it is. The who is just kind of cool to know. So I would like less focus on that.
There's always too much focus on attribution, whereas, you're dealing with an incident. It doesn't matter if it's the kid next door or if it's a nation state in Antarctica, called Cobra Command, who knows? It's still, you have an incident that you're dealing with at this point. Anyone else want to take this? And then we'll go to another couple of questions. Johannes.
I really, oh, sorry.
Oh, Mark.
Yeah, and I was just going to say the entire early focus on like JetBrains and Team City and such, which there was no real data behind it, but everybody sort of was looking for the person at fault. It's sort of like the basic bad incident response and lessons learned, where you find out, hey, who do we fire? Here it's sort of which vendor do we fire? That's not really what this is about. It's about understanding it. As far as advanced adversary, in this case, I think was appropriate, but quite often the eye rolling happens if it's used as an excuse for why you lost my data again, kind of. So, Mark. Yeah.
Mark, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll start with my frustration. I don't really appreciate when the media tries to cover individual incidents, because, and I think that all of my fellow panelists who have probably been through this with me, I've never seen a story about a specific case actually correct in the media. 100%, there's usually substantive facts that are not accurate, mainly due to the way that they're getting their information. And I don't know how helpful it is about like an individualized case, especially with something so broad, to talk about one specific one, because really that's kind of missing the forest through the trees. But I will add, though, that I really appreciate when the media helps amplify what I think is really important messages that I think we all espouse, but struggle with getting into the grandmas of the world. I love it that my family calls me about this all the time. My dad is constantly reading news about SolarWinds and like, don't tell me anything you can't tell me, right? But it's getting it into the public consciousness, which is just raising awareness about these really important issues that are things that people don't think about every day, like identity management and supply chain. And I really appreciate that is a narrative that we have a basis to have a discussion on now, which was harder to do before this incident. So I do appreciate that.
Right. All right. So switching topics, a lot of our attendees are both technical, and we have a lot of management on here. One of the things that I really love working about SANS is really trying to get people to think about, like, the actual takeaways. Organizations are in a kind of a spot that, they're looking at all these things that they can do, and it's hard for a CISO or a manager to say, let's do all the things. And I'm sure you've been asked this question a lot, but I'm kind of hoping that, I'm looking at John or, some of the other from the blue team side. If you're kind of in that, where do we begin? Not just to handle the incident response and hunting side, but they're concerned. They're saying, what is the first couple steps that I should probably do here? Now that we're looking at the lessons and takeaways as a whole across all of our presentations, what would you recommend? What is the baseline hygiene basics that they should focus on if they're concerned about supply chain attacks from here going forward? So I'll ask John to lead that off. He's a requisite blue team expert here, and then see if anyone else wants to jump in.
Yeah, so, like I said, supply chain attacks are incredibly difficult to spot just because they come from something you trust, right? That's the whole point. So what do we do? Well, I think one of the things a lot of people fail on is, like you said, just the basics, right? If you're looking at the CIS top 5 and we're saying, like, could you find if something new was on the network, if something was talking about or using a new protocol you hadn't expected or seen before? Those are the things that will key you off to even these very complex attacks. It's the stuff that's, how sensitive is your ability to find uniqueness or anomalies? And if your house is a disaster, right, kind of everything looks like an anomaly and you're not going to find the needle in the haystack. And so having that basic control of like what's on the network, what protocols are being used on the network, how are we authenticating, right? Where are all our identities kept? Is all of this just thrown all over the place? Or, do we have a clean, like, this is where truth comes from, these are our policies on what's allowed and what's not allowed? Just getting the organization right will help you spot harder to spot things. And so I think that's probably a good place for a lot of places to start, just because, and it is a really difficult thing to do, but that's what it takes a lot of the times, is just being able to be more sensitive about your detections and getting the noise out of the way so you can do that.
Who also like to jump in?
So those that know me know, especially in the control systems realm, know I'm a big fan of asset identification and management. I think that that's really applicable here. There's a lot of focus immediately on the technical details and all those things, and that is all very important. But I think every organization could take a little time to go through a kind of internal audit on who are our suppliers? Do we actually have a list of them? To what level are we trusting their code, connectivity? What are we trusting? From a cloud and software as a service provider perspective, what information is kind of going in? Taking a high level data and trust inventory would go a long way to a lot of business objectives, not just security. And I think that type of going on that journey will pay a lot of dividends, in addition to being able to cover down on some of the basic questions about things that ultimately enabled this entire set of intrusions. So that inventory of trust and suppliers would be a great first step that unfortunately a lot of organizations don't really have a good handle on.
I agree. Evan, you had...
Yeah, just going back to it, like, just to add on to what John was saying, just stick with those basics, stick with the meat and potatoes, find out what kind of behavior should not be happening on your systems. How common is it for a security product service to be disabled? That just isn't a normal kind of activity, and it should be spotted immediately. And so just basically find out what those things are on your systems and then be able to detect changes to that baseline.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, something both of you and everyone has been kind of saying in here is that the basic hygiene stuff, going back to even the critical controls, which, a lot in the security industry is saying, just a set of these rules and, kind of, thoughts, but it's really hard to implement, and it's even harder to potentially measure. And a lot of organizations struggle with both, is that, hey, we're good. We've implemented one of the controls, but how do you actually measure that? How do you know you're good? And it's something that we're still struggling with, and a lot in the industry out there is trying to create appropriate measures for that, so everyone can potentially get a status sheet for that as a whole. You talked about supply chain attacks in general. I remember when I was in the Air Force, one of my earliest intrusion cases I ever had to run through was a supply chain attack against the FAA, because all these airports and all these different airlines were all connected in to the back end, and you would end up seeing all this data being transferred back and forth and user logins. And it was just this massive scope of how do you, trying to control that is, one of the most difficult things, but the know yourself mantra there, I think, is incredibly useful. All right, so last question then, and we'll have to close at this point because we're a little bit over time. Going back to the actual takeaways, a lot of organizations, as you take a look at SolarWinds, ends up, doing a lot of self-reflection at this point. And I remember when I was at Mandiant, back doing incident response, there was always this discussion that, organizations are, truly embarrassed, like we try to keep this contained. But how much should organizations be leaning forward in saying that, hey, I also, have this issue that's going on, to be able to share their own experiences? And this is kind of like this ultimate thing that you always get this, everyone goes into the turtle shell here a little bit, but SolarWinds honestly gets in this, mindset is, how do you recommend to organizations saying, hey, we all got to learn from this together. It's okay. We all got picked on the playground at some point in our lives. What are your thoughts on this? Like I always go back to, like, how do organizations share effectively the lessons learned, and takeaways, so we could actually become better as the industry? So I know it's a big question. If it's like, hey, we're never going to solve it today, that's one answer. But where do you all stand on this as a whole? I'll start with Katie. She's to my left, and she's from cyber threat intelligence and sharing. I know it's one of her favorite topics, but what do you recommend to organizations, if they're affected by this, and lessons learned, sharing, so we can all learn from it?
I mean, regarding sharing in general, I think that it's fascinating. FireEye started this whole thing, right? And everyone was like, oh, FireEye got compromised, but they did a great job in terms of sharing. So look at them. Let's get rid of this stigma of blaming victims. Like, we all get compromised. It happens. Try to figure out what anonymized information, what TTPs can we share out of it. So let's get rid of this stigma. It happens to everyone.
Anyone else?
I can jump in there. One of the drums I'm always beating is standardization, right? If we have these frameworks like MITRE ATT&CK and all of these things where we are in a standardized, organized way saying, this is a thing that happens, this is how we're going to refer to it, can you catch that? The more of those kind of frameworks we have, and there's other ones popping up, right? The better we're going to be. I always talk about in my courses, like, we don't want to be in this position where every organization is an island and has to independently discover how to do all this on their own, right? The faster we can get to one person finds it, we're all protected against it, the better we're going to be at this. And it's those standards and frameworks that even if you're unwilling to share specifics about your attack, you can say, I saw an attack done through this tactic, and then sharing that with the community at least will help in general.
That's good thoughts. Anyone else? Final thoughts?
Yeah, just a quick one. Yeah, when we talk about cyber hygiene, current controls, the issue always comes up. It's hard, and it doesn't get easier by waiting. First of all, and do it slowly. Do it one piece at a time. One exercise we always recommend in 503 is sit together with a couple of your engineer, take 10 minutes of network traffic, go through it, try to figure out what's going on. And take it from there. There are some measures around it, at the SANS.edu website at our graduate school, we had people students write papers about various ways to implement critical controls, how to measure some of this. So use what others have done, leverage that and apply to your own organization. Take any shortcut you can find.
Excellent. All right, so we're going to be closing out now, and to close out, I would like to, again, I'm going to prep all the speakers to think about this for a second while I'm going to do some housekeeping. But final thoughts, I go around the room. I'm going to ask you, final, 10 to 20 seconds, closing out. What is the one thing you want as a takeaway or final thought about SolarWinds as we're moving forward? Just let the attendees know that all the slides, all the presentations are going to be posted online at sans.org. As soon as we get them processed and uploaded, also will appear in our SANS Institute YouTube channel. So I'm going to start on my far right, start with Evan, and we'll just go right to left at that point, around the clockwise around the room. So Evan, final thoughts.
Yeah, don't underestimate how important it is to do your own analysis. Don't just rely on all of the information that's out there on the web. There's a lot of good stuff, yes, but there's also some stuff that's misleading.
Excellent. Mark.
I think that this entire series of incidents highlights that we don't get to choose the tactics the adversary uses. We don't get to choose the capabilities that they develop, but we do get to choose what our defensive posture looks like and how much we make them have a hard time getting into our environments. And every time they interact with your environment is another opportunity for you to defend and detect yourself. And we need to kind of flip the paradigm from the adversaries are 10 feet tall to, this is a doable thing. Like, we have what we need to be able to do this. We just need to put in the work. And, defense is doable, as the other Rob Lee likes to say all the time. And so it's doable and we can do it together.
Excellent. Katie.
Yeah, I would say just focus on things you can do. I think hopefully we're all past the sky is falling, everyone panic, fear, uncertainty, doubt. There's a lot of that out there. Focus on things that you can control. How can you make your networks better? How can you improve? Because things like this happen, compromises happen. So just take it as an opportunity to get better. Don't panic. And we're in this for the long haul. So get sleep. Don't stay up all night doing anything. It's been 6 weeks. So take care of yourselves.
That's great. John.
Yes. Focus on your anomalies. That is how you're going to catch difficult stuff. I want everyone to go back to work or stay at work, and right now fire up your SIM, look at stuff that has only happened in one place, only happened one time, only been visited by one system, one user. And then across all of those things, there'll be a lot of them. Start grouping it by system, username, location, IP address, autonomous system number, whatever it is. You don't know how it's going to correlate, but something there will lead you to the stuff that you did not think you could find, but you absolutely can find when you take that approach with it, because everything that's bad is an anomaly in some way, as long as you can find it.
Mike.
So really just the idea that, especially an incident like this, is going to be a long-term project, right? It's not going to be something that we're going to fix quickly or with a certain amount of money, and it's not a thing that can be fixed. It's going to require process change. And so with any type of business process change, that's going to have a huge impact on your organization. Plan accordingly.
Excellent. And Dr. Ulrich.
Yeah, there was a comment here in the chat, so I want to reference that. That's a lot of these techniques, they were great if you're sort of the top 1% of security teams. What is the rest of the 99% going to do? And do something. Don't get intimidated by, hey, there are these 100 things I need to do. Pick one that's easy, pick one that has impact, do it, and show value, show that you actually are able to detect and prevent attacks and move from there.
Excellent. All great thoughts. I really appreciate everyone able to attend our first SANS Lightning Summit on this topic with SolarWinds. We're going to be looking to host more of these on cutting edge topics just in time to get everyone kind of up to speed on a variety of things that are out there. If you like the format, please let us know. We're always open to comments, criticisms, and more. But we really try to make these things, getting leading experts from the community. Our instructors are frontline practitioners, as you could see. They teach some of our best courses, but the reason why they're good, as you could see, is because that they're out there in the field engaging this on a daily basis. So on behalf of SANS, and thank you for your organizations for allowing you to speak on SolarWinds. I know that most of you had to ask for permission to be able to do that. You know, at this point, it is extremely grateful of SANS that they've given your time to us to be able to put a summit like this together in this rapid format. Without further ado, my name is Rob Lee. I'm the Chief Curriculum Director here at SANS, and thank you for attending the first SANS Lightning Summit.